Okay. Good morning. And so today we're going to just kind of talk through, and this is hopefully a somewhat interactive conversation because we've been trying to get this restarted now for going on almost 2 years since the Big Switch Arista acquisition. And so there's been a lot of work going on in the background to make this possible. And what we're looking at now is how do we move this forward? How do we actually get a functional working version of ONL that everybody's happy with, that all the pieces are being merged and such? So, Steve Noble, I'm over at Amazon. I also run a nonprofit called NetDef that does a lot of work with FRR. And then I'm the chair for the Dent project. And now I'm technically the lead for the ONL project here at OCP. So the history is pretty straightforward, right? 2013, we proposed to take what Big Switch had already written and use it as an OCP project. And then it was adopted in 2014. And through there, you saw a lot of contributions. We built a lab. We did a lot with interoperability. You know, everything was going relatively well. Then that we were acquired. When we were acquired, the view on supporting ONL basically dropped. And so we didn't see any support, realistically, from Arista. Every so often, if something get merged, but it might be months before we would see actual work. And so we focused on getting Arista to say, we're done. We'd like it to go back to OCP and for you guys to take over. And so that's what we've done. From a legal standpoint, everything is pretty much done. But our goal, obviously, and that's a nebulous goal, right, 2022, is to get everything cleaned up and format changes. So what do we need to do, right? I think it's pretty straightforward for anyone who looks at the ONL repository. We need to put together a team, a couple of people who can go through, review these pull requests, get the pull requests merged, and get ONL to a point where people are feeling supported. Because what we're seeing right now is that people are closing pull requests. And so they might have submitted a system 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and they're like, nobody's merged it, nothing's happened, and so they close it. And we don't want that. So within this initial goal will be to work on all the backlog, and then also probably contact people who have closed pull requests to see if they want it to be put in. The team would essentially consist of mostly individuals who understand ONL and ONLP very specifically. And so there are a few ODMs and such who do understand ONLP. Fork the necessary repositories, that's already been done. I have maintainer access, administrator access to the ONL repository. I have code waiting to change all the submodules over to a different location because Arista Big Switch will continue to use the GitHub repositories that they have, right? So we can't take them. So we've forked them, and then we'll start it so that ONL builds off of its own fully controlled system. And then after, hopefully, we can get everything cleaned up, we need to engage the community and we need to figure out, you know, is this something that needs a TSC? Is this something that needs a monthly call? What is the cadence that would be acceptable and who's interested, right? You know, at the moment I'm running it, but my goal is not to say I'm going to be the lead forever. My goal is to say I want to get this thing working to the point that we can actually start a conversation about somebody running the project. So the next steps, essentially bringing together a TSC-like entity, however the OCP wants to put that together. Determine how to move forward. And so there are a few suggestions that I have. And if anyone's not aware, as I mentioned, I'm the TSC chair for DENT. The DENT project is also built on ONL. And so when I look at the things that we can do with ONL, I think to myself, these are very similar to the things that we want to do with DENT, right? So one of the first ones is separate out ONLP. Make ONLP a module, a submodule, instead of being just part of the code. And the reasoning there is that there are consumers out there, there are customers of ONL who only use ONLP. And they have to go, and if anything gets updated or whatever, they have to pull in the new version, they have to separate themselves, right? We don't want that. If somebody wants to use ONLP, which is really the main benefit to running ONL, they should be able to pull that in without any real issues. And so the hope there is that any companies that are using OwnLP will be able to just take it directly from the repository and contribute back and help to keep everything running in a healthy manner. The other thing there is, if anyone's ever seen the patch sets that get applied to ONL, they're patches of patches, right? It's a meta patch with a whole bunch of sub patches in it. And so reviewing that type of code is very hard, right? Especially since we have people who understand the kernel, we have people who understand ONLP, we have different sets of people, but they had to look at everything in order to review the code. And so the second thought is to separate the kernel from ONL. So instead of having the kernel be literally pulled in by ONL from the kernel.org and patch with all of these patches, we would fork the kernel essentially to a version that we want to use and then apply each of the patches onto it so that we end up with a live kernel image. And so when people go to push in new requests, new patches, those patches go onto that kernel and we can test it, rather than they have to submit a patch that's a patch onto the kernel. And so this is something that we're seeing struggling with DENT. And so it seems logical again, right? Because some people may want to run different kernels, and that's what we're hearing. Some people may want to run a different version of Debian. Some people may not want to run Debian, right? And so giving people access to essentially three parts: ONL, which is really the build system that puts together the only installable image; OwnLP, all the platform control drivers, the fans, the LEDs, all of that. I'm not really talking about ONL itself in this talk, but the OwnLP part, which seems to have value, and then the kernel, which is useful to have since it has a lot of patches that come from vendors that are being applied. And what we're seeing, and probably other people have seen the same issue, even updating within LTS. So for example, we're using 5.10 LTS for the DENT project. And when we try to move minor versions, the patches break, right? And so the way that we avoid that is by moving the kernel out and then making it so that when someone adds a new feature or we upgrade the kernel, we can actually call out, contact the right people, and get the patches updated and have a functional kernel. And the last thing it ends with is it adds allows for easier upstreaming. And so yet again, this is another thing that's being hammered through in the Dent project is, shouldn't we be upstreaming? And when ONL started, all of these pieces, the CPLD drivers, all of this, they weren't going into the kernel, and there was no agreement that they could be in the kernel. And so a lot of that work has been going on over the last year or two to try and convince the kernel maintainers that these types of code are actually valuable to have in the kernel. And so if we can get to support for all of these peripherals into the kernel, obviously that makes life a lot simpler when we go to update the kernel, or when people make modifications to the kernel. So I have my call to action. Essentially, it's join the mailing list if you're not. Let us know if you're interested in helping to try and get everything cleaned up. And then I've got a timeline. It may or may not be true. I mean, we can start working on the repository since it's in OCP. We can start working with the submodules that we've cloned. We can start to get this cleaned up. Will we do it by the end of the year? Maybe, but you know, that's how that is. And for the other piece, there's the wiki, and then there's the mailing list. So now, I was hoping to move to questions, comments. Some people are positive about ONL. Some people don't like ONLP. There's a lot of differing opinions. And so people have comments, thoughts. You know, is this worthwhile to take the time to clean up ONL and to clean up ONLP? Go ahead.
You mentioned it will be a single repository in the end. Is that going to be ONL, ONLP, and should be together, and there won't be a distinction anymore?
So what you're going to end up with is the Open Network Linux repository. And then you're going to have submodules like we have now for all of the different parts. And one of those submodules will end up being the latest kernel that we're using. And one of the submodules will end up being ONLP. And so the goal will be to make it so that if you want to contribute to ONLP, you contribute to ONLP directly. And people review it as code in ONLP. And same thing with the kernel. For the build system, I don't suspect that there'll be a lot of people working on that. And honestly, depending on how things go, the build system can always be migrated to a different system. But in the end, ONLP is a valuable part of ONL. Go ahead.
So there was an effort back in 2018, 2019 to do an ONLP v2. Is there an effort going to be to move? Sorry, but are we going to reopen that ONLP v2, or is it going to just be something we abandon?
So, without going too deep into that quagmire, ONLP v2 was developed, and it was developed to support specific end users. And there was supposed to be documentation and some other stuff done, but that all kind of fell to the wayside when the Big Switch Arista acquisition happened. So we have OwnLP v2, but we only have certain boxes ported to it. And the goal was to actually do the porting ourselves. I say ourselves, but basically Big Switch do the porting for all of these systems over to OwnLP v2. Do you have anything in OwnLP v2 that you're interested in? Is this Stratum?
Yeah, so it's Stratum, and we have a bunch of platforms that are on OwnLP v2 that we use. We're just kind of trying to decide as project maintainers, do we backport to OwnLP v1, or do we kind of expect that V2 will be available at some point?
Well, so V2 is available, right? I mean, you have the ability to use a V2. I think the problem is that it's not really clear, right? So for V2, generally, you put together an allow list of boxes, and then you only build OwnLP V2. Well, we're happy to take input contributions,
Sure.
that sort of thing.
I
But-
think the bigger context or bigger part of this question is that when we work with vendors, they see like 4 or 5 different platform APIs that they feel like they need to support for different customers. You know, Sonic Platform API, now Dent, ONLP V1 for some customers, V2 for others. And like that's a burden, especially on some of the newer, smaller box vendors. And so I guess the move from ONLP out of the project will allow it potentially to be reused between at least some of those areas. But I think some clarity around if you as a vendor implement this specific API, it's going to be broadly used by a broader customer base and you won't have to maintain different forks would be, I think, pretty helpful for them.
Okay. So I'll probably go back and have that conversation to really come up with an idea there. Right now I'm just trying to reckon in my head, how do we have an OwnLP V1 and a V2? And, well, anyway, we actually used the Stratum project's concept for OwnLP V2 as the way that we do the Dent project, by basically allow listing certain devices and doing them. But all of those have been written in OwnLP V1. I think partly because the vendor doesn't have a compelling reason for V2.
Yeah, and if the community, you know, has decided V2 as an experiment is not necessarily useful, we can also consider, you know, consolidating so that there's not two different choices for people. Maybe we can have a discussion later. I just wanted to bring up the topic because I think the pain point that we've seen for vendors has been primarily that they have, you know, a different platform API for each one of these sub-projects, and it's hard on their engineering teams to try to push all their bug fixes into all of those and keep them up to date. So any sort of consolidation, reuse, or dependence on like common submodules seems like it would be a win for everyone.
Yeah, so the other thing that's happening kind of on the side with Dent is that we have a vendor who's attempting to build an OS not using ONL and not using ONLP even. And so they're upstreaming kernel drivers and support for different devices and into the kernel and board support and such. And so that may end up being, I don't know, I don't want to say the right way, but that seems like it's kind of going in the right direction, right? Which is OwnLP came out, it's really useful. So I can tell you for me, it's super useful because I have a vendor, I give them a design, they build that design, and then they give me OwnLP. They don't question it. They don't have to try and figure out anything, right? They just write OwnLP, and they give it to me. And so for them, it's been pretty straightforward and very quick for getting the systems working. But the kernel side of it, where you have to upstream, I think currently we're looking at 5.16 possibly to get the board support packages into it. And then there's still a lot of discussion going on with Greg and others about what should and shouldn't be in the kernel, right? We can give a really good example is PoE. We have PoE switches, and we have a PoE daemon that can control them, but it's not in the tree because it's not part of the tree, right? It's basically a user land system daemon that runs. But yet again, someone has written a very rudimentary PoE interface for the kernel, but they haven't even attempted to upstream it. And so this becomes a question of, you know, can we get the Linux kernel to allow for PoE to be introduced to it, because if we can, then it really simplifies it for everybody, right? So instead of having to go bespoke for each system and put together things, they essentially just have to give the configuration, and then they know that in the kernel it's supported, and then however anyone wants to work with it, they can, right? And that's the thing about ONLP, is you work with it in one way. You interact with it, and it gives you the data, and it handles things. If you want to change that behavior, then you either have to write a shim, or you have to do something else to get the same information. Whereas in the kernel, you would just make a system call of some sort and pull in that data. Other question, thoughts?
What will happen with the ONL certified program, ONL accepted?
ONL certified and ONL accepted. The first answer is we don't have the hardware. It's still somewhere, and we have not really focused on how we would bring that together, because OCP itself doesn't really have like a data center to put the hardware in, right? And we've got about, well, there was about 2 racks of hardware available. But the certification process could still be done. And we may take that from how other projects are doing things. But if people find that of value, then yes, we would do the ONL certified.
Okay, can I ask another one?
Yeah.
Do you have the plan how you will move forward with the kernel? Because currently, when it's all combined, you can say, okay, the vendor did their support, it works. When you move kernel out, and you are trying to build your roadmap for going with the newer and newer kernel, the vendor should catch up. Is there any process to exclude vendor if they are not catch up? How we can enforce vendors to support their boxes in ONL?
Well, you have 2 problems, right? The first problem is that the vendor is going to support the kernels that their customers are using, right? So some vendors may be using 5.4. Some vendors may not even be using 5, right? And so all of their stuff is written specifically to those kernels. And so there has to be a driving force that convinces them that they should do this work to port it forward, or somebody has to do it.
So will ONL have their own stream of supported kernels, like an LTS, or let's say the ONL version X is based on that kernel? This is where the most of the support is there, but there is a separate development stream which is happening for the latest and greatest kernel. How? Because if you will just say you can use wherever kernel you want, this will lead to the huge fragmentation, and you will not be able to understand what is supported where. So the box A is kernel 5, box B is kernel 5.10. You know, this can be quite challenging to manage.
Right. And so I think, honestly, there should just be 2 tracks. There should be what you're upstreaming right now and backported to the kernel that's being used. And those should be the only 2 things that should be done. And so if they want to do it in ONL, then they backport it to the kernel that ONL or Dent or any of the projects are using. And otherwise, they should be upstreaming everything to the latest kernel. And so the question of a supported kernel, right, we always say, well, for Dent, we say 5.10. For ONL, there's a 5.4 for x86, but not for ARM. And so ONL is quite a bit behind. But I don't think exclusion is the thing, right? Essentially, if you have an allow list and somebody hasn't updated their system to work with that kernel, then you take them out of the list.
But for how long you will keep them? Okay, you have 100 devices, and in half of the year, there is no traction for that specific device. It's not updated. It's being dumped by the vendor. Should it be in the ONL, or should you just clean it out and say, okay, no longer supported. Use the previous release.
So if your question is, should we remove them completely from ONL, I don't honestly think that we have to. I think that because of how OwnLP works and how most of the code is in OwnLP, that by not building them, they're not there. But also, the other side of that is they may have patches that go onto the kernel. And so if they do, then if those patches aren't working, obviously they would be removed too, right? So there can be an ebb and flow. And if you remember the OCP or the ONL list, it basically listed everything, the CPLD version, the ONI version, the U-boot or the BIOS version, right, and the version of ONL, because we wanted to make sure that people understood this is what was tested. I can't guarantee that the next one is going to work. But again, these are things to bring to a conversation about ONL, and I am over time. So thank you, everyone.